I curse you. You shall never see the wealth you crave. Your sons shall...
I don't know. Yusuf no say when I sleep, I don't sleep. I know they notice anything.
Mike hissed in frustration and walked away. But just as Ekaite was about to resume her chores, her eyes widened. She froze in place. Just as Ekaite was about to resume her chores, she froze in place, staring at something. A red smear of blood on Mike's leg.
Oga, you get wound?
Ekaite asked, her voice trembling.
No, why do you ask?
Mike responded, his brows furrowing. I see blood for your leg, she said, pointing. Mike glanced at his leg and froze. There it was, a faint but unmistakable smear of blood. He quickly walked away, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the events of the previous night. Days passed and everything seemed to return to normal, as if nothing had happened. Mike buried himself in his business, hoping to forget the strange occurrence. But on the night of the next full moon, the peace was shattered. Mike had stayed out late to watch a football match with friends. When he finally got home, he went straight to his room and collapsed onto his bed, drifting into a deep sleep. Moments later, he awoke abruptly and looked into the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, seemingly normal. But then, a strange sensation crept over him. His body tensed and a searing pain coursed through his veins. He tore off his shirt, clawing at his skin as dark fur sprouted. His teeth elongated into fangs. His hands and feet twisted into claws. In moments, the transformation was complete. Standing before the mirror was no longer Mike Kalu, but a wild beast. The beast roared and struck the mirror, shattering it into countless shards. The loud noise jolted Ekaite awake in her room.
It be like Sima Oga dey in trouble,
she whispered to herself. Quickly, she ran to Mike's room. As she opened the door, the sight before her froze her in place. There, in the room, stood a monstrous creature with glowing eyes and fur-covered limbs. Ekaite's scream caught in her throat as the beast turned to face her. Before she could react, it pounced on her. At dawn, Mike woke up on the cold floor of his room, naked and disoriented. His body ached and his head spun with confusion. He reached for his robe and stood up, only to be greeted by the horrifying sight around him. His room was in shambles, shattered glass, bloodstains, and to his utter horror, the lifeless body of Ekaite. Her body lay crumpled on the floor, claw marks marring her once vibrant skin. Mike's heart raced as he staggered back, covering his mouth to stifle a scream.
What happened here?
He whispered to himself.
How did an animal get into my room?
His mind reeled with questions. Could it have been his dog? Could someone have broken in? He couldn't call the police. What would he tell them? How could he explain this? Quickly, Mike wrapped Ekaite's body in the bed sheets, carefully pulling it out of his room. He stepped outside, looking around to ensure no one was watching, then carried the body to his car trunk. As he drove out of the compound, Abi, his gatekeeper, questioned him.
Oga, this one where they come out this early. Hope all is well.
Will you stupidly open the gate?
Mike backed, his voice trembling with barely contained panic as he sped out of the compound, leaving Abby standing at the gate, confused and shocked. As Mike drove through the quiet streets of the estate, his mind raced. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make sense of what had happened. Soon, he reached a secluded area by the bush. He parked the car, stepped out and opened the trunk. There lay Ekaite's lifeless body, wrapped tightly in the bedsheet. Mike's heart pounded as he glanced around, ensuring no one was watching. Satisfied that he was alone, he dragged the body out and dug a shallow grave. The earth felt heavy and the weight of guilt pressed down on him as he buried her. Once he finished, he got back into his car and drove off, his hands trembling on the wheel. When Mike returned home, he wasted no time. He cleaned his room meticulously, scrubbing away the bloodstains and gathering the shattered glass. After taking a long bath, he changed into fresh clothes and stepped out again, this time heading straight to his mother's house. Madam Edna was in her kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared breakfast. The sudden incessant ringing of the doorbell startled her.
Who is that person that won't let me have peace in my own house?
She yelled, wiping her hands on her towel as she headed for the door. When she opened it, she saw Mike standing there, drenched in sweat and looking terrified.
What is it, son?
She asked, concern crazing her face, but Mike didn't answer. He brushed past her and hurried into the house, leaving her standing at the door, puzzled. She followed him into the living room, where she found him sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. Mike, what is wrong? She pressed, sitting beside him. He looked up at her, tears streaming down his face.
Mama, something terrible has happened.
He began, his voice breaking. Slowly, he recounted everything, the strange occurrences, the horrifying events of the night. Madam Edna listened, her face pale with shock. When he finished, she took a deep breath. This is really serious, she said, her voice trembling. Are you sure of what you are telling me?
Yes, Mama.
Mike replied, his voice firm despite the tears. She nodded slowly. If that is the case, we need to see a man of God. This doesn't sound ordinary. Moments later, Mike and Madam Edna arrived at the church. The weight of Mike's predicament evident in their hesitant steps as they walked to Pastor Bami's office. Bami, a stout man with piercing eyes and a calm demeanor, gestured for them to sit.
Tell me, young man,
The pastor began, fixing Mike with a steady gaze.
what brings you here?
Mike hesitated, glancing at his mother before speaking.
Pastor,
He began, his voice slow.
something is happening to me. I don't know what it is, but it's terrifying. I wake up with blood on my hands and mouth. There are victims with claw marks on their bodies, but I don't remember doing anything. It's like I'm involved somehow, but I can't explain it.
Pastor Bami's expression grew more serious as he listened. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together.
And this happens all the time?
He asked. Mike shook his head.
No, sir. Once in a month, mostly when the moon is full. I don't know what to do.
The pastor studied him for a long moment before finally speaking.
Let us pray.
He said, standing up. He placed a firm hand on Mike's shoulder and began to pray, his voice powerful and commanding. As the prayer continued, Pastor Bami suddenly stopped and stepped back, his face etched with a mixture of fear and awe.
There are dark forces surrounding you, Mike.
He said gravely,
This is not just about you. It's generational. The roots of this go deep and they are tied to your bloodline. You must return to your village and ask questions. Only then will you find the answers you seek.
Madam Edna and Mike exchanged worried glances. What kind of dark forces? Madam Edna asked, her voice trembling.
I cannot say for sure,
Pastor Bami replied,
but there is something ancestral at work here. Go back to your village, speak with your elders. They will know better.
Mike and his mother thanked the pastor and left the church. The drive back home was silent at first, the weight of Pastor Bami's words hanging heavily between them. Mike stared blankly at the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Madam Edna, who had been quiet for most of the ride, finally broke the silence.
Let me know when you're ready.
She said softly.
We need to pay a visit to your grandfather.
Pao knows. He should know something about this. Mike glanced at her, his expression filled with uncertainty.
Paulus, do you really think he would know anything, Mama?
Madam Edna nodded firmly.
He has lived through more than you can imagine. If this is truly a generational thing, he will have answers.
The next day, Mike and his mother, Madam Edna, began their journey to the village. As they arrived at their family home in Ogodo village, they found Pa Ono sitting in his wheelchair in the garden, enjoying the gentle breeze. One of the domestic staff walked up to him.
Sir, your daughter is here.
The maid said,
Oh, Bring her to me.
Paunos replied, his voice filled with surprise. Madam Edna and Mike walked over to him, and after exchanging greetings, Mike wasted no time. He began narrating everything: the bloodstains, the victims, his visit to Pastor Bami, and the reason for their visit. Paunos listened intently, his face revealing little emotion. When Mike finished, Paunos cleared his throat.
Go and rest for now,
he said quietly.
We'll discuss this matter tomorrow.
But deep down, Paunos was unsettled. He didn't want to tell them the truth. He couldn't bring himself to reveal the dark secret he had buried for decades. That night, the house was enveloped in silence, with everyone peacefully asleep. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the stillness. Madam Edna jolted awake, the sound echoing through the halls like broken glass. Grabbing the torchlight, she stepped cautiously into the hallway to investigate. Her heart pounded as she searched for the source of the noise. Then she heard it, a low guttural growl. Fear gripped her. "Billy, what are you doing inside?" she muttered, assuming it was the family dog. But as she turned, her torchlight illuminated a horrifying sight. It wasn't Billy, it was the werewolf. Before she could scream, the beast lunged at her, its claws sinking deep. A blood-curdling scream tore through the house. Waking Paunos, terrified and helpless due to his blindness, he reached for his phone and called one of his staff, Jide.
Go check what's happening.
Paunos ordered, his voice trembling. Jide grabbed a flashlight and cautiously searched the house. The faint smell of blood led him to the hallway, where he found a pool of blood on the floor. Terrified, he quickly retrieved his gun and followed the blood trail. At the end of the hallway, he noticed a broken window. Stealing himself, he approached it and looked outside. His blood ran cold. There, in the dim moonlight, he saw the werewolf hunched over Madam Edna's lifeless body, feeding on her.
No!
Jude shouted, raising his gun, but as he aimed, the werewolf turned, its glowing eyes locking into him. With lightning speed, it bolted into the darkness. Jide fired a shot, but missed, the sound reverberating through the night. The next morning, Mike found himself lying down in a nearby bush, his body stained with blood. Panic gripped him as he quickly got up and ran back to his grandfather's house, hoping no one would notice his absence. He rushed into the bathroom, scrubbing the blood off his skin as if he could erase the guilt consuming him. As he was coming out of the bathroom, he heard loud cries echoing through the compound. Startled, he quickly dressed and stepped outside. The air was heavy with grief as the household staff wept openly. Curious and alarmed, Mike ran to his mother's room, but she wasn't there. Desperate for answers, he rushed back to the courtyard and grabbed one of the maids by the arm.
Where is my mother? Why is everyone crying?
He demanded. Through her tears, the maid responded, "A wild animal attacked. I know that lived her while we were all asleep. She's dead." The words struck Mike like a thunderbolt. He fell to his knees, a guttural cry tearing from his throat. His chest heaved with anguish as he realized the horrifying truth. He had killed his own mother. The beast inside him had taken her life. Consumed by guilt and despair, Mike stumbled to his grandfather's room. Paunos was sitting in his chair, his face wet with tears.
Pa?
Mike cried, falling to his knees before him.
Please help me. I can't help myself anymore.
Paunos, his own sorrow evident, asked Mike to sit. After a moment of silence, he began to speak.
Mike,
He said, his voice trembling.
I have kept this secret for too long. What is happening to you is my fault. Years ago, I stole the ring of wealth from the witch Olumiri in the cave of Uri. I was young, foolish, and blinded by greed. The witch cursed me. She said that while I would gain immense wealth, my life would be filled with suffering, and so it is. The moment I returned to the land, I became blind. I have lived surrounded by riches, but unable to see the beauty of my wealth. Within a year after my return, my wife and eldest daughter died, and now this curse has reached you.
Mike stared at his grandfather in disbelief, his mind reeling with the weight of the confession.
What do I do now?
Mike finally asked, his voice breaking.
How do I go back to normal?
Paonus's face crumpled with guilt.
You must take the ring back to the cave of Uri,
he said, tears streaming down his face.
It is the only way to end this curse.
Mike cried out in frustration, sprawling on the ground.
How am I supposed to do that?
He yelled.
I don't even know anyone in this village.
Overcome with rage, he stood up and pointed an accusing finger at his grandfather.
You caused this, and now I'm the one paying for your sins.
Without waiting for a response, Mike stormed out of the room, leaving Paono sobbing in regret. After hours of deep thought, Mike stormed into his grandfather's room. His face was set with determination as he announced,
I'm ready. How do I start?
Paonus raised his head slowly, his expression weary but resolute.
I'll give you the ring,
he said.
Then you will take me to the shore of the great river of Ushimili. Under a great Udara tree, I buried Onumiri's hand years ago. You shall exhume it and return it to the cave of Uri.
Mike's resolve faltered, and he let out another cry of anguish. The sound tugged at Paonus's heart.
Please, my son,
the old man said softly.
Forgive me.
That night, fearing he might harm someone, Mike drove far into the bush, away from any human habitation. He spent the night in the bush, bracing himself for another transformation. But to his surprise, he slept peacefully as a human and woke up as one. The morning sun filtered through the trees, and a small sense of hope bloomed in his chest. Quickly, he ran back to his car and drove back to his grandfather's mansion. Later that day, Mike and Paono set off for the great river of Fushimili. The journey was silent, both men lost in their thoughts. When they arrived, Paonos described the tree to his grandson. Mike scanned the area and soon spotted the towering Udara tree. Following his grandfather's guidance, Mike began digging at the base of the tree. In no time, he unearthed the witch's hand, now reduced to bones. Carefully, Mike gathered the bones into a small sack and handed it to his grandfather. Paonos opened the sack, touched the bones, and dropped the cursed ring alongside the bones.
Now, take me to the riverbank,
Paonus instructed. Mike wheeled his grandfather to the edge of the river. The sound of the water rushing against the rocks filled the air, a soothing yet ominous backdrop. Paonos gestured for Mike to kneel, and with trembling hands, he placed a blessing on his grandson.
May the spirits of our ancestors guide and protect you.
Paonos prayed.
This journey will be treacherous, but it is the only way to break the curse.
He paused, his voice heavy with emotion.
After I leave, you must drink from the waters of Ushimili. It will strengthen you for the trials ahead.
Paonos then blew a small whistle, summoning his staff, who came quickly, wheeling him away toward the car, while Mike remained at the riverbank, staring into the water and contemplating the perilous path that lay before him. Long after Paonos left him, Mike continued staring into the water as if it held the answers to his questions. Summoning his courage, he bent down and scooped some water into his palms. He hesitated for a moment before drinking it. Almost immediately, he began to feel strange. His body shook violently, and before he could comprehend what was happening, he transformed into a werewolf. Unlike his previous transformations, this time his human consciousness remained intact. Terrified by the change, he howled, his voice echoing across the river. Gathering himself, he grabbed the bag containing the witch's bones and climbed into a small boat. With trembling hands, he began to paddle. When he reached the middle of the river, the boat started to shake violently. Mike's heart raced, but he didn't stop paddling. Suddenly, the water erupted, and a massive multi-headed monster emerged from the depths. Mike whimpered in fear as the creature drew closer. It sniffed the werewolf and let out a deafening growl before sinking back into the water. The werewolf, though shaken, was grateful to have been spared. Unable to understand why, he pressed on, paddling until he reached the other side of the river. Once ashore, he bolted into the forest, his movements faster than any human could achieve. The transformation had heightened his senses and speed. He ran tirelessly, dodging trees and leaping over roots until he reached the base of the mountain. The climb was grueling, exhaustion set in, but Mike pushed on, determined to complete his task. By the time he reached the mountain's peak, night had fallen. He howled into the darkness, the sound reverberating through the wilderness. Unable to go any further, he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. At dawn, Mike, the werewolf, stood up at the mountain summit, scanning the area for the cave of Uri. There was nothing in sight. Could Paunos have lied to him? Doubt gnawed at his mind. Trusting his instincts, he began descending eastward. As he moved, the ring in the bag began to glow faintly. Taking this as a sign, he continued in the same direction. By the time he reached the base of the mountain, the ring was glowing brightly. The cave must be near. He soon discovered a new problem. The cave's entrance had been sealed with stones, a consequence of its collapse when Pauno stole the ring. Mike realized he would have to remove the stones to gain entry. The werewolf's claws proved useful as he began the arduous task of clearing the blockage. For 2 long days he toiled, stopping only briefly to eat meals of crows and wild birds he managed to catch. Finally, he uncovered a black cloak. Beneath it lay dried bones. Could this be the witch? He wondered. Opening the bag, he emptied the bones and the ring onto the ground. Suddenly, the stones around the cave moved, as if guided by an unseen force. Reconstructing itself, Mike watched in awe, never having witnessed anything so strange. Before he could process it, the bones began to assemble themselves. Piece by piece, they formed a skeleton. Flesh and sinew appeared, and in moments, the one-eyed witch stood before him, whole once again.
Oh, it's been a while,
She said, stretching her restored body.
I miss this form.
Mike looked down at himself, expecting to transform back into a human, but nothing happened. Disappointed, he let out a sorrowful howl. The witch turned her attention to him, her sinister grin widening.
Oh, I didn't realize I had company,
she said.
Now, get out of this cave. If by sunset you have not crossed the great Oshimili River, you shall remain cursed forever.
Terrified, the werewolf bolted from the cave, the witch's eerie laughter echoing behind him. He ran without stopping, his powerful legs carrying him through the forest at incredible speed. Hunger and exhaustion didn't matter. His only thought was to escape the curse. Finally, he reached the river of Oshimili. Without hesitation, he climbed into the boat and began paddling frantically. As he passed the middle of the river, he glanced up and saw it. The sun was setting. Panic shot through him as he paddled with all his might, racing against time and the curse that loomed over him. Back in the village of Ogodo, Ola, one of Paonos's maid, was busy preparing dinner in the kitchen. The rich aroma of spices filled the air as she worked diligently. Suddenly, another maid called her attention from outside the kitchen. In a haste to respond, Ola carelessly dropped the kitchen napkin near the burner. As she left, the napkin caught fire. Within moments, the flames spread rapidly, engulfing the kitchen. Before anyone could react, the gas cylinder exploded with a deafening roar. Chaos erupted as the fire consumed the mansion, once the most beautiful house in Ogodo. Some of the staff managed to escape the inferno, but Pa Onos, who had locked himself in his room, did not survive. By the time the villagers arrived with help, it was too late. The mansion had been reduced to ashes. Mike opened his eyes and realized he had returned to his human form. Disoriented, he touched his face as if confirming if he was no longer the werewolf. A wave of relief washed over him as he looked around. He noticed his clothes still lying by the riverbank. Quickly, he dressed up and began walking through the bush. To his surprise, he saw his car parked nearby. He approached it cautiously and realized the car door was open and the key was fixed in the ignition. On the dashboard, there was a note. It was from his grandfather.
Take this car and go back to the city. Never return to this village, not even for my funeral or your mother's.
Tears streamed down Mike's face as he read the note. Grief and guilt weighed heavily on him, but he knew he had to follow his grandfather's instruction. With a heavy heart, he started the car and drove away. He didn't know what to think or do, but one thing was certain: his life would never remain the same. Mike had moved on. He was now happily married to Amaka and was building a new life in the city. One day, while in his shop, he received a call. It was from his wife's sister. His wife was in labor and had been rushed to the hospital. Panic surged through Mike as he grabbed his car keys and sped to the hospital. Upon arrival, he rushed to the receptionist.
I'm here to see my wife,
he said, breathless. Oh, it must be Mr. Kalu. The nurse replied with a bright smile. Your wife has given birth. Come with me. The tension that had gripped Mike melted into a joyous smile. He followed the nurse, his heart pounding with excitement. As he entered the room, he saw Amaka lying on the bed, cradling their baby. Tears of joy streamed down his face as he approached them. He let out a joyful cry and gently picked up his newborn child, a bouncing baby boy. The baby was perfect. Tiny fingers, soft skin, and an angelic face. But as the baby opened its eyes, Mike's heart skipped a beat. Our actions, whether good or bad, can have lasting consequences on ourselves and those around us. It is important to act with integrity and caution, as undoing the effects of our mistakes can be far more difficult than making the right choices in the first place. If you enjoyed the story and would like to see more interesting stories, please consider subscribing to this channel, not forgetting to turn on the bell notification icon so that once another video is being posted, you will be the first to be notified. You can also check out these videos here. I promise you won't be disappointed. Till we meet again in my next video, remain blessed.